Alrighty, so what I want to do here is go over the requirements for Dev 0, show you in general my output. And I almost hesitate showing you my output because the idea is that not that your code look like mine, your code reflect your own ideas. But I think it might be helpful for you to see an implementation of the requirements. And I did write this, I ended up rewriting this for this semester because as you may have heard me say, that this is a new course. Therefore, we've covered different parts of Python code. Therefore, I need to have that reflected in mine. And I noticed when I did the week 2, I was starting to talk about functions. We haven't really covered functions, even though she starts to talk about them in week 6. So I decided I would challenge myself to write it without functions, which was honestly more of a challenge than I thought it would be, but that's good because that's the idea of this. So for our class, you will have 3 times in the semester that you will write code, come up with your own concept, come into a code review with me. And so let's just go ahead and open that. Actually, let me just open it itself rather than just pop it up on the calendar. So if you don't know, if you haven't heard me say, because we have 3 of these and 50% of the class, so 50 divided by 3, right? So is 17%. So each of these is 17% of your overall grade. So it's an important part. And honestly, even without this weighted, for me, based on what I know I want to achieve and what I talk to with most students who come into class like this, what they really want to be able to do is write code to implement their own concept, their own ideas, right? So that's really what you're doing here. And again, the most important part of what I think we do here is actually do this. And this is where it can get a little harder because I'm not giving you, like you have had so far, a specific objective. I'm allowing you to come up with a concept. Here's my suggestions. When you think of what you're going to write code for, the more personal might be the easier. It's kind of like when we ask you to write about yourselves. That's typically a little easier. So you might come up with something that's very close to something that's important to you. For me, something that's important to me and I spend a bit of time on it is because I'm a fairly new owner. I have had an electric vehicle for a year. I'm tracking my cost. And that's important to me. But it's also not necessarily a simple process because there's several factors, and you'll see this in my code, and I had to handle that. And that's where it becomes more meaningful. So I want meaningful output here, right? So this is just a list here of the things that you need to make sure your code has implemented. Now we've learned more than this, and I definitely say use everything you've learned in this last section to use as much as you feel you can, but definitely have to see these things in your code. So converting strings to ends and ends to strings, which might be more related to the second idea here of getting and validating user input. Implementing randomization into your code. We definitely talked about that. This would kind of make sense if you're doing games, but you'll see even with my code, I randomized some beginning data so I'd have something to play with. Something that she didn't necessarily call flow control, but it is called flow control. So the if, the if, and the else's. So make sure you have these blocks, and definitely you'll probably use them more than once. For loops, right? Now, loops typically you can use loops for input, which I did for validating. You also use loops for looping over list. So at least make sure you have at least one example, but again, you may use more. I definitely did in my code. And then for a list, you want to have your code update a list somehow, right? And then some type of reporting from looping over the list or using that in some way in your code. So this is something I've talked about before. Make sure your code, and I'm going to say mostly here. I didn't say it in the requirements, but mostly PEP 8. I showed how to look at that or set that up in week 2. Actually, I think I did it at the end of week 1. So make sure you're doing that. That will be a few points if you have all these PEP 8 errors. So make sure you've done that. Ask if you want to know more about it. Now, here's the thing that I know can be, and let me just say this, the idea is for you to write your own code, not to get somebody else's code and reuse it. Because that's not going to help you. Trust me, if you want to do this for even an added skill or ultimately a primary skill, you want to be able to write code on your own without looking or using somebody else's code. Now, if you do find I want to use one thing, cool, just make sure, and I wouldn't want to see very much of it, make sure you provide a reference, a URL for where you got it. Now, I've put functions as optional just because I covered them last time, and honestly, it was really hard to write mine without it, but and for those of you that have more experience, sometimes it's good. And I would say try not to write code too much outside of what we've done. And honestly, because I think it's good experience to say, based on what I've learned so far, here's code that accomplishes that. So when you write code and you come into a code review, and this is kind of like there's two big steps here: writing code that meets the requirements, it's working code. Then you come into a code review session, which I will have talked about this concept here in the calendar for the beginning of this week already. I've actually kind of given you an idea. You'll have a sign up around this. But just know in general, here's how this works. You come into a session with me. I have you go over your code so that I can hear how well you can talk about and understand and articulate that code. It's a really important part. If you bring me not working code, and then, stop and think about that, because you need to make sure you've tested all parts of your code that it works the way you want to. Later on, you may learn something called test-driven development, where you actually write tests that actually test your code through the code. It's like code testing code. But for this assignment, you need to make sure your code runs. And Dr. Angel's course, the 100 days, man, there's really good examples of, here's the kind of output you would expect. Okay. So again, I'll talk more about this just in the attendance, because I want to spend just a few moments here looking at my output to show you how I've handled these requirements. Okay, so the first thing is I've just been playing already, so I think I'll drop some of this. So I'm going to clear my screen, and then I'll just first, run my code. So hopefully by now you have this part down as well, right? And the difference between running, debugging, setting breakpoints, which I definitely had to do based on the way I wrote this. So it's good. But in general, here's what I would do. First is I would run my code. I did some ASCII art. It was pretty simple. There's a website to go generate some of that. Here's where I did the randomization, and I'll just show you in the code where I did this. I'll scroll up. I set some constants, but right here in the code, I actually ended up doing random integer between 1 and 50. So I said generate between 1 and 50 entries. And then for each, okay, and then I did a for loop. So for each in the range of 1 to the number of random entries. So it's going to iterate over based on that. So you can see here that number was 27, right? And then it just generates data. So in this case, random choice, but I said either home charging or supercharging, because for me that was important. And if it was home charging, then I ended up doing, because home charging is less expensive than supercharging, and that's just based on charging locations, okay? But in this case, I calculated a random cost based on a different int value, right? And then I just append it. So what happens here is it ends up with what's called a multi-dimensional list. All right. Now, by the way, I don't output it. We definitely could. But if I hit 2, and I'll show you this in a minute, my menuing option, review EV data. So you can see there was 27 sessions. And if I hit 2, I ended up having 9 home charging sessions and 18 supercharging stations. And again, that's what came out of running this. So it was matter of fact, let me just show you. I think it might be worth actually showing you. And I've set a breakpoint here. So now I'm going to drop out of running my code, and I'll run it in debug so you can see this. So in this case, you can see I'm changing to debug mode, and I've actually stopped right. Is it right here? Yeah, so actually it hasn't yet because I've already generated the data, but now it's asking for my menu, which I'll show you. So let's say in this case, if I go over here and I look at my variables, oh, I haven't done it yet. So let's do 2. Oh, I must not have set my breakpoint right. So let's try that again. Let me drop that, bring this over here, run that one more time, make sure I've set, oh, I must have just actually, I did. I took it off. Okay, so let me set it again. Run and debug. So in this case, it stopped. It's outputted the banner, but it stopped. But what I was trying to show you here is the multi-dimensional list. So I have one big list that inside of it has lists for each session, a list for each session. And that was what worked for me for my data. And then I stopped here. So again, using this debugging idea is really important and helpful. Honestly, very helpful. Okay. So at this point, you could walk through. This is what I showed you before. It definitely helps. I'm just going to tell you, I use that more than I thought I would, because sometimes I feel like I can just read my code and debug it, but it doesn't always happen. Okay, so then in my program, what I did is just basically ask the user what they want to do. They want to enter more data. They want to review the charging data. This is where I showed you how to just get some reporting, or they want to quit. Okay, so if they want to enter more data, then I had a couple of steps I have to validate. And so let me just show you that kind of in action so you can see it. So if I run my code, and if I want to enter more data, the thing with EV charging is that there's a limit to how much, kind of like your gas tank, you can only put in so much. And it says, first I want to know is how much is already in my tank. So if I say there's 100 miles in my tank, the max I can go to 270. So the first thing I say is I have 100. So the next thing is, do you want to charge to your limit of 270? If I wanted to start charging, I say yeah, and then it adds it in. So if I say yes, and it lowercase, uppercase works, then it asks me for my location. So let's say I'm at a supercharger. Boom. So now what happened is this is just a little, what we call a toast, basically a message that shows what it added. And then what I can do is review my data. So now I can look at the fact that I just added a new, matter of fact, did I show you this before? Yeah, I didn't show you in this case. Yeah, 32 sessions. I guess this is the right one. So I added one session to the supercharging. It gave me that output. So in this case, this is where it gets a little more involved of asking, and this is what I was showing. So I used while. I set conditions. While is really good to use for validation. So I said valid input equal to false. And then I said, while not valid input, do this process. And then once I validate my input, and this I do later on, then I can change that valid input to true, and then it'll continue through my program and then ask for my charging location. So that's how I handled that piece. Let me just move back over. So so far, I've shown you randomization, and I've shown you if statements, elif, and else's. I've done loops. I've updated my list. I've done PEP 8 compliant, and it's all my code. So, but the other thing I can show, the other thing I did is I actually, and this is where I did a little reporting based on the data itself. Right, and this is where I looped over that multi-dimensional list based on if it's location. Then I added, and there's multiple ways I could have done this, but I decided to kind of keep it fairly straightforward, where I did plus equals. The entry at the first index would actually be the cost. And then adding one so I could just track how many sessions were done for supercharging versus home charging. And then I outputted that to the user, showing those costs and just the number of. And then else, in this case, if it was not one, so the user selected one, selected two for reporting, right, and selected anything else or zero, then it drops out and it quits, and it sets that run program to false, and then it outputs a little bit of ASCII art in the end. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff you want to be able to first write code that works, right? Get help if you need it, right? Come into a code review session with me. Make sure you know how to share your screen because I want to see your setup. That's going to be part of my code review, is having you actually show me your local setup. We may spend a few minutes talking about that. But I wanted to at least give you an output, right? And again, the idea, and I almost hesitated showing my code because sometimes sometimes students might think that's what they have to write. And the truth is, you want to write, right, to accomplish your desired output. And this is really testing how well you got the concepts that have been covered so far. So I've said this before, I'll say it again, come get help. And definitely the sooner you come get help, the better. If you want to just talk to somebody, reach out also on Discord. Folks out there will, I'm sure, be willing to help you as well. I hope this gives you an understanding. Oh, and just to say where this code lives, it'll be under your private repo, under a directory called dev, under a directory called dev1, and then that's where code lives. I should also see the README file and the flowchart. I actually need to update my flowchart just a little bit because in writing it, I changed a little bit of the way I thought it would function, which is pretty typical, right? So make sure when I'm looking at this code, I see your README file, call it main.py, use lowercase here, okay? No spaces in your file names. Those are just good standards to follow. And remember, make sure it's PEP8. If you want to ask me about that, come chat. All right, hope this helps you give at least an understanding of what an example would look like. Look forward to connecting with you.